And FBI Director Kash Patel is about to face some tough questions when he testifies this week on Capitol Hill after some mistakes in his handling of Charlie Kirk's assassination investigation. Conservative activist Chris Rufo posted this that ultimately led to the suspect's arrest. Here's how Utah Governor Spencer Cox sees it.
This was a co-lead operation. So the FBI was co-lead with the state. We worked very closely together. I think Director Patel would tell you it was flawless. It was everybody just trying to decide, is this a good idea?
Okay, so this is absolutely massive. And we need to talk about it right now because Kash Patel, the former Trump loyalist and current FBI director, is facing a wave of crippling lawsuits that genuinely threaten to destroy his career and his credibility in ways that are almost unprecedented for someone in his position. The most damaging case comes from 3 fired FBI agents who allege that Patel knowingly broke the law by axing top bureau officials specifically to appease former President Trump. The federal suit, which was filed in Washington, D.C., claims the firings were political retaliation, and it includes the explosive allegation that Patel had to terminate key staffers because his job security relied on dismissing those involved in cases related to the president, which is an absolutely stunning admission if true. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics. We're going to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. This bombshell filing has prompted outrage across political and law enforcement circles, and it's fueling demands for Patel's ouster and a probe into his conduct that goes far beyond just these firings. The lawsuit names Patel and Attorney General Pam Bondi alongside the FBI and DOJ for wrongful dismissal and retaliation and civil rights violations, and it's seeking full reinstatement and back pay for the sacked agents. The allegations say that Patel directly told staff he could not protect them because the FBI attempted to imprison the president, and he hasn't forgotten, which shows clear political motivation behind the firings that violates every norm about how federal law enforcement is supposed to operate. National news coverage and legal analysts are highlighting how the filing cripples Patel's credibility across the Bureau, with the agent's lawyer, Abby Lowell, calling it an open and shut case of abuse of power and employment law violations. Patel is also in the spotlight for lawsuits involving his partner, Alexis Wilkins, which further amplifies public scrutiny and creates the appearance of chaos at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The retaliation and abuse of power allegations expose deep politicization and alleged misconduct.
FBI Director Kash Patel faced a congressional oversight hearing today into why the Epstein files have not been released. They concerned the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, who ran a sex trafficking ring. One of President Trump's campaign promises was to release the files, which he is now refusing to do. The CBC's Karina Roman is in Washington and joins me now. And so, Karina, what was the FBI Director Kash Patel grilled about in terms of the Epstein files?
Well, some Democratic House representatives tried to pick up where their Senate colleagues left off yesterday at the hearing yesterday, the Senate one. They're incredulous at his assertion at the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing
inside the FBI under Patel's leadership that raises fundamental questions about whether the Bureau can function as an independent law enforcement agency or whether it's become a tool for political vendettas. The wider fallout from these lawsuits includes workplace retaliation claims and public trust collapse and serious impacts on ongoing Trump-related investigations that Patel was supposed to be overseeing impartially. This legal crisis represents a turning point for Patel, and it may trigger broader shakeups within Trump's remaining inner circle and FBI leadership and the ongoing web of political legal battles that are stretching into 2026. The political targeting and legal exposure and agency panic that these lawsuits have created make this a must-cover story because it goes to the heart of whether federal law enforcement can maintain any independence from political pressure. The fact that this lawsuit was filed by 3 former FBI officials who had exemplary records and decades of service makes it much more credible than if it were just coming from people with obvious political axes to grind. These are career law enforcement professionals who dedicated their lives to the FBI and who are now putting their reputations on the line by filing federal lawsuits alleging systematic political retaliation. When people like that come forward with these kinds of allegations, it demands serious attention because they understand the risks they're taking and presumably wouldn't do it unless they believe the misconduct was severe enough to justify those risks. The involvement of Abby Lowell as the lawyer representing the fired agents is also significant because Lowell is one of the most respected and experienced attorneys in Washington who has represented high-profile clients in major cases for decades. The fact that someone of his stature is taking on this case and calling it open and shut suggests he's very confident in the strength of the evidence. And the legal claims Lowell doesn't take cases he doesn't think he can win, especially high-profile cases that will attract enormous media attention and political scrutiny. The allegations about Patel's partner Alexis Wilkins and the various lawsuits involving her create additional problems for Patel because they raise questions about whether FBI resources and his position are being used for personal purposes rather than legitimate law enforcement functions. When the FBI director's personal life becomes entangled with lawsuits and public controversies, it undermines public confidence in the Bureau's independence and professionalism. So yeah, this is a genuinely massive story that could end Patel's career, and we need to break down exactly what's alleged in these lawsuits and why they're so damaging. All right, so let's dig into the specific allegations in the lawsuit filed by the 3 former FBI agents, because the details are what make this case so legally and politically devastating for Patel. According to the complaint, the 3 plaintiffs, Brian Driscoll and Stephen Jensen and Spencer Evans, were all senior FBI officials with decades of experience and exemplary service records who were suddenly fired after Patel took over as FBI director. The lawsuit alleges that these weren't firings based on performance issues or misconduct, but rather purely political firings designed to remove anyone who had been involved in investigations of Trump or his associates, or who was perceived as not being sufficiently loyal to the MAGA agenda. The most explosive allegation in the lawsuit is that Patel told staff members that he had to fire certain people because his own job security depended on it. According to the complaint, Patel allegedly said that the FBI had attempted to imprison the president, meaning Trump, and that Trump hadn't forgotten, and that Patel needed to remove people Trump viewed as enemies in order to keep his own position. This is an absolutely stunning admission if it can be proven, because it shows Patel understood that what he was doing was politically motivated rather than based on legitimate management or performance concerns. It's essentially an acknowledgement that he was using his authority as FBI director to settle political scores rather than to improve the Bureau's operations. The wrongful dismissal claims are based on federal employment law and civil service protections that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of political retaliation. Senior FBI officials, like the plaintiffs, have what are called property interests in their employment, which means they can't just be fired without cause and without due process. The lawsuit alleges that Patel violated these protections by firing the plaintiffs without legitimate reasons and without following proper procedures that would have given them opportunities to respond to any allegations and present their side of the story. When you have career civil servants being fired for political reasons without due process, that violates fundamental principles of merit-based civil service that have been in place for over a century. The retaliation claims are particularly serious because federal law protects employees from being punished for engaging in protected activities like participating in investigations or testifying to Congress or reporting potential wrongdoing to inspectors general. The lawsuit apparently alleges that the 3 plaintiffs were targeted specifically because they had participated in investigations of Trump or had testified about Trump administration conduct or had otherwise engaged in activities that Trump and his allies viewed as hostile. If that can be proven, it would constitute illegal retaliation that violates multiple federal statutes protecting whistleblowers and witnesses. The civil rights violations that are alleged apparently involve deprivation of constitutional rights, including due process, rights under the Fifth Amendment, and possibly First Amendment rights, if the plaintiffs were targeted for their speech or associations. When government officials use their authority to punish people for exercising constitutional rights, that's one of the most serious forms of official misconduct because it strikes at the heart of the Bill of Rights and the protections that are supposed to constrain government power. Federal civil rights lawsuits under Section 1983 allow individuals to sue government officials who violate their constitutional rights and can result in both compensatory and punitive damages. The demand for full reinstatement means the plaintiffs don't just want money, but actually want their jobs back, which creates enormous practical and political complications for Patel. If a court orders that these officials be reinstated, then Patel would have to work with people who have sued him and proven in court that he violated their rights by firing them. That would be an incredibly awkward and probably unworkable situation, which is why employers usually try very hard to settle these kinds of cases rather than risk reinstatement orders. The fact that the plaintiffs are demanding reinstatement rather than just monetary damages suggests they're very serious about vindicating their rights and their reputations rather than just looking for a payday. The back pay claims could amount to substantial sums depending on how long the litigation takes, because these were senior officials earning six-figure salaries with valuable benefits packages. If they ultimately prevail and are awarded back pay from the date of their firings until final resolution, that could easily run into millions of dollars, especially if you factor in lost pension contributions and other benefits. More importantly, though, the back pay claims keep the case alive and give the plaintiffs leverage to demand full reinstatement rather than just settling for cash payments. The involvement of Attorney General Pam Bondi as a defendant alongside Patel is significant because it suggests the firings were coordinated at the highest levels of the Justice Department rather than just being Patel acting alone. If Bondi was aware of and approved these politically motivated firings, then she shares legal liability, and the scope of the alleged misconduct becomes much broader. The lawsuit apparently alleges that Bondi and Patel worked together to identify and remove FBI officials who were viewed as insufficiently loyal to Trump, which would make this a systematic purge rather than just a few questionable personnel decisions. The allegation that Patel told staff the FBI attempted to imprison the president is particularly interesting because it provides context for his motivations. Patel apparently views the various FBI investigations of Trump, including the classified documents case, and the January 6th investigation as illegitimate attempts to imprison a political opponent rather than as legitimate law enforcement actions. This mindset, where investigations of Trump are seen as political persecution rather than appropriate responses to evidence of criminal conduct, is what drives the political retaliation that the lawsuit alleges. If Patel genuinely believes the FBI was weaponized against Trump, then from his perspective, firing people involved in those investigations might seem justified, even though it clearly violates legal and ethical rules. The credibility that Abbe Lowell brings to this case cannot be overstated because he's represented numerous high-profile clients in major investigations and trials, and is widely respected even by people who disagree with his clients. When Lowell says this is an open and shut case of abuse of power that carries enormous weight because he has the experience and judgment to assess the strength of legal claims accurately, the fact that he's willing to put his reputation on the line by making such definitive statements suggests the evidence must be very strong, including probably documentary evidence and witness testimony that corroborates the plaintiff's allegations. The employment law violations that Lowell is referring to likely include violations of federal statutes protecting civil service employees from political retaliation, as well as possible violations of FBI personnel regulations and collective bargaining agreements if applicable. Federal employment law has evolved over more than a century to create protections against exactly the kind of political spoil system that apparently operated in Patel's FBI, where jobs depend on political loyalty rather than merit and performance. Rolling back those protections by firing career officials for political reasons undermines the entire civil service system that's supposed to ensure professional, competent administration, regardless of which party controls the White House. The lawsuits involving Alexis Wilkins add another layer of scandal, because they raise questions about whether Patel is using FBI resources or his position to support his partner's personal legal battles. Wilkins has apparently filed multiple defamation lawsuits against mega influencers and podcasters who made various allegations about her, and there are questions about whether the FBI is providing her with security protection or other resources that wouldn't normally be available to someone who isn't a government official. If Patel is misusing FBI resources for personal purposes, that's a separate form of official misconduct that could result in additional investigations and potential criminal charges. The public scrutiny and appearance of chaos that these multiple lawsuits create are damaging, even if Patel ultimately prevails on the legal claims, because they create a narrative of dysfunction and political corruption at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. When the FBI director is embroiled in multiple lawsuits alleging abuse of power and political retaliation and misuse of resources that undermines public confidence in the Bureau and makes it harder for the FBI to do its job effectively, witnesses and sources are less likely to cooperate with the FBI when they see it as a politicized organization rather than an independent law enforcement agency. So let's talk about what happens next and how these lawsuits are likely to play out, because the legal and political implications are enormous. The immediate procedural steps will involve Patel and Bondi filing motions to dismiss, arguing that the claims don't state valid causes of action, or that they're entitled to qualified immunity, or that the plaintiffs lack standing, or any number of other procedural defenses that defendants typically raise in these kinds of cases. However, based on what we know about the allegations, the motions to dismiss are unlikely to succeed because the claims appear to be well pleaded, and to state valid causes of action under established law courts are generally reluctant to dismiss civil rights cases on the pleadings unless the allegations are clearly insufficient as a matter of law. If the cases survive motions to dismiss, then we move into discovery, where the plaintiffs will have broad rights to request documents and take depositions and gather evidence to support their claims. This is where things could get really damaging for Patel, because discovery in federal civil rights cases is quite extensive and can uncover a lot of information that defendants would prefer to keep private. The plaintiffs will be able to request all documents related to the firing decisions, including emails and memos and communications between Patel and Bondi and between Patel and the White House. They'll be able to depose Patel and Bondi and other witnesses under oath and ask detailed questions about the motivations for the firings and the processes that were followed. The political pressure on Patel is going to intensify significantly as these lawsuits proceed, because every new revelation and discovery will generate media coverage and congressional scrutiny. Democrats in Congress are already calling for investigations into Patel's conduct, and these lawsuits provide additional ammunition for those calls. Even some Republicans who might otherwise support Patel may start distancing themselves if the evidence of political retaliation becomes overwhelming, because defending obviously illegal conduct becomes politically untenable, especially in competitive districts. The impact on FBI morale and operations is already significant and will only get worse as these lawsuits drag on. Career FBI agents are watching their director face serious allegations of political retaliation and abuse of power, and that has to be incredibly demoralizing and concerning. How do you maintain professional standards and institutional integrity when the person leading your organization is accused of firing people for political reasons? How do you recruit and retain talented people when they see that career success at the FB? I might depend on political loyalty rather than merit and performance. These questions don't have easy answers, and they represent serious long-term damage to the Bureau's effectiveness. The precedent that these cases could set for accountability of FBI directors and other senior officials is important, because it demonstrates that even people at the highest levels of law enforcement can be held personally liable when they violate employees' rights through political retaliation. For too long, there's been a sense that senior officials could engage in this kind of misconduct without facing serious personal consequences because they had qualified immunity, and because suing the government is difficult and expensive. These cases, if successful, could establish clearer standards and stronger enforcement mechanisms that deter future officials from engaging in similar conduct. The settlement negotiations that will likely happen at some point could be complicated, because Patel and Bondi will want to settle to avoid the continued negative publicity and the risk of losing at trial. But the plaintiffs may not be willing to accept reasonable settlement offers if they're focused on reinstatement and vindication rather than just monetary compensation. If the plaintiffs really want their jobs back and public acknowledgement that they were wronged, then settlement becomes much harder, because those are the kinds of things defendants are most reluctant to provide. The broader implications for the Trump administration are significant, because these lawsuits expose the systematic politicization of federal law enforcement that many people have suspected but has been hard to prove definitively. If Patel is firing FBI agents to appease Trump and keep his own job, then what does that say about how other agencies are being run, and what other forms of political retaliation are happening throughout the executive branch? These are questions that investigators and journalists will pursue aggressively, and that could lead to additional scandals and legal problems for Trump and his appointees. The impact on ongoing Trump-related investigations is also concerning, because if Patel has politicized the FBI, then can anyone trust that investigations involving Trump or his associates are being handled fairly and impartially? This creates opportunities for defense lawyers to argue that their clients are being selectively prosecuted, or that evidence was obtained through politically motivated investigations. Even if those arguments don't succeed legally, they create public doubt about the legitimacy of the investigations which serves Trump's political interests. So where does this leave us as we watch Kash Patel crumble under the weight of these crippling lawsuits? We have 3 former FBI officials with strong credentials and an excellent lawyer making detailed allegations of political retaliation and abuse of power. We have explosive claims that Patel admitted his job security depended on firing people Trump viewed as enemies. We have civil rights violations and employment law violations and systematic politicization of federal law enforcement. We have additional scandals involving Patel's partner and questions about misuse of FBI resources. We have discovery that could uncover even more damaging evidence. We have political pressure mounting from Congress and the media. And we have long-term damage to FBI morale and public confidence. These lawsuits represent a potential career-ending crisis for Patel because even if he ultimately prevails on the legal claims, the damage to his reputation and credibility may be irreparable. The allegations that he fired career FBI officials for political reasons strike at the heart of what's wrong with politicizing law enforcement, and they resonate with the public's concerns about whether federal agencies are serving justice or serving partisan interests. Whether Patel survives this crisis depends on the strength of the evidence that emerges in discovery and whether he can mount any credible defense to the allegations, or whether the documentary and testimonial proof makes his misconduct undeniable. Either way, these lawsuits have already succeeded in exposing serious questions about his fitness to lead the FBI and his commitment to the Bureau's independence and professionalism that are core to its mission.